Please forgive me on my reading out loud and mispronouncing things. I'm gonna do my best. All right, and sometimes I get a little choppy, but making every allowance for the excitement and turmoil of war and the mentality of the defeated people, the Black Codes were infamous pieces of legislation. Let us examine these codes in detail. They cover naturally a wide range of subjects. First, there was the question of allowing Black people to come into the state. In South Carolina, the Constitution of 1865 permitted the legislator to regulate immigration, and the consequent law declared, quote, that no person of color shall migrate into and reside in this state unless within 20 days after his arrival within the same, he shall enter into a bond with two freeholders as sureties in a penalty of $1,000 condition for his good behavior and for his support. So there you go. There's that. Especially in the matter of work, was Black people narrowly restricted. In South Carolina, we must be especially licensed he must be especially licensed if he was to follow on his own account any employment except that of farmer and servant. Those licensed must not only prove their fitness, but pay an annual tax ranging from $10 to $100. Under no circumstances could they manufacture or sell liquor. Licenses for work were to be granted by a judge and were revocable on complaint. The penalty was a fine double the amount of the license, one half of which went to informer. Mississippi provided that every freeman, free Black person, or biracial shall on the second Monday of January 1866 annually thereafter have a lawful home or employment, and shall have written evidence thereof from the mayor, or from a member of the board of police, which license may be revoked for cause at any time by any authority granted the same. This is fascism. This is fucking white supremacy fascism. Yeah. Detailed regulations of labor was provided for in nearly all these states. Louisiana passed an elaborate law in 1865 to, quote, regulate labor contracts for agricultural pursuits, end quote. Later, it was denied that this legislation was actually enacted, but the law was published at the time, and the Constitutional Convention of 1868 certainly regarded this statute as law, for they formally appealed it. The law required all agricultural laborers to make labor contacts for the next year within the first 10 days of January. The contracts to be in writing, to be with heads of families, to embrace the labor of all the members, and to be, quote, the building on all minors thereof. Yeah. Each laborer, after choosing his employer, quote, shall not be allowed to leave his place of employment until the fulfillment of his contract, unless by consent of his employer, or on account of harsh treatment or breach of contract on the part of the employer. And if they do so leave without cause or permission, they shall forfeit all wages earned to the time of abandonment. In the case of sickness of the laborer, wages for the time lost shall be deducted, and where the sickness is feigned for purposes of idleness, and also should refuse to work be continued beyond 3 days, and offered the offender shall be reported to the justice of peace, and shall be forced to labor on roads, levees, and other public works without pay. So basically back into slavery, until the offender consent to return to his labor. When in health, the laborer shall work 10 hours during the day in summer, and 9 hours during the day in winter, unless otherwise stipulated in the labor contract. He should obey all proper orders of his employers or his agent, take proper care of his work mules, horses, oxen, stock. Also, of all agricultural implements, the employers shall have a right to make a reasonable deduction from the laborer's wages in injuries done to animals or agriculture implements committed to his care, or for bad or negligent work. Bad work shall be not allowed. Failing to obey reasonable orders, neglect of duty, and leaving home without permission will be deemed disobedient. No worries. For any disobedience, a fine. I got a visibility. There we go. Let's do that. No worries. For disobedience, wait. Oh, an order's neglect duty and leaving their home without permission will be deemed disobedient. For any disobedience, a fine of $1 shall be imposed on the offender. Now, $1 is a lot. For all lost time from work hours, unless in case of sickness, the laborer shall be fined 25 cents per hour. For all absence from home without leave, the laborer will be fined at the rate of $2 per day. Laborers will not be required to labor on the Sabbath except to take a necessary care of stock and other property on plantations and do the necessary cooking and household duties, unless by a special contract. For all thefts of the laborers from the employer of agriculture products, hogs, sheep, poultry, and any other property of the employer, or willful destruction of property or injury, the laborer shall pay the employer double the amount of the value of the property stolen, destroyed, or injured, one half to be paid to the employer, and the other half to place in the general fund provided for in this section. No livestock shall be allowed to laborers without the permission of the employers. Laborers shall not receive visitors during work hours. All difficulties arise between the employers and laborers under this section shall be settled, and all fines be opposed by the former. If not satisfactory to the laborers, an appeal may be had to nearest justice of the peace and to freeholders, citizens, one of said citizens to be selected by the employer and the other by the laborer. And all fines imposed and collected under this section shall be deducted from the wages due and shall be placed in a common fund to be divided among the other laborers employed on the plantation at the time when their full wages fall due, except as provided for above. What a stipulation for people just to be sick. You can't be sick or anything. It's just another way to put them back into slavery. Similar details, regulations of work were in the South Carolina law. Elaborate provisions was made for contacting people of color servants to white masters. Their masters were given the right to whip moderately servants under 18. Others were to be whipped on the authority of judicial officers. These officers were given authority to return runaway servants to their masters. The servants, on the other hand, were given certain rights. Their wages and period of service must be specified in writing, and they were protected against unreasonable, quote-unquote, tasks, Sunday and night work, unauthorized attacks on their persons, and adequate food. Contracting black people were to be known as, quote, servants. The contractors as masters. Wages were to be fixed by the judge, unless stipulated. Black people of 10 years of age or more without a parent living in the district might make a valid contract for a year or less. Failure to make written contracts was a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of $5 to $50. Farm labor to be from sunrise to sunset, with intervals for meals, servants to raise at dawn, to rise at dawn, to be careful of master's property and unanswerable for property loss or injury. Be careful of master's property and unanswerable. Oh yeah, I read that. Long time was to be lost time was to be deducted from wages. Food and clothes might be deducted. Servants were to be quiet and orderly, and to go to bed at reasonable hours. No night work or outdoor work in bad weather as to be except in cases of necessity. Visitors not allowed without the master's consent. Servants leaving the employment without good reason must forfeit wages. Masters might discharge servants for disobedience, drunkenness, disease, absence, etc., enticing away the services of the servant was punishable by a fine of $20 to $100. A master could command a servant to aid him in defense of his own persons, family, or property. House servants at all hours of the day and night and all days and of the week must answer promptly all calls and execute all lawful orders. Thank you for approving it. The right to sell farms products, quote, without written evidence from the employer, was forbidden in South Carolina and some other states. So they're just putting them back into slavery and indentured servitude. Jesus Christ. Make them pay hefty fines. A person of color who is in the employment of a master engaged in husbandry shall not have the right to sell any corn, rice, peas, wheat, or other grain, any flour, cotton, fodder, hay, bacon, fresh meat of any kind, poultry of any kind, animals of any kind, or any other products of a farm, without having written evidence from such master or some persons authorized by him, or from the district judge or the magistrate, that he has the right to sell such products. I bet a lot of that came under scrutiny under racism. I bet a lot of that did. There were elaborate laws covering the matter of contracts of work. A contract must be in writing, and usually, as in South Carolina, white witnesses must attest to it, and a judge approve it. In Florida, contracts were to be in writing, and failure to keep the contracts by disobedience or impudence was to be treated as vagrancy. In Kentucky, contracts were to be in writing and attested by a white person. In Mississippi, contracts were to be in writing, attesting by a white person. And if the laborer stopped working, his wages were to be forfeited for a year. He could be arrested, and the fee for his arrest must be paid by the employer and taken out of his wages. There were careful provisions to protect the contracting employer from losing his labor. In Alabama, quote, when any laborer or servant having contracted as provided in the first section of his act shall afterwards be found before the termination of said contract in the service or employment of another, the fact shall be prima facie evidence that such person is guilty of violation of this act. If he fail to and refuse to forthwith discharge his said laborer or servant after being notified and informed of such former contract and employment, Mississippi provided. The ever civil officers shall, and every person may, arrest and carry back to his or her legal employer any freeman, free black person, or biracial person who shall have quit the service of his or her employer before the expiration of his or her term of service without good cause, and said officer and person shall be entitled to receive for arresting and carrying back every deserting employee aforesaid the sum of $5.10 per mile from the place of arrest to the place of delivery, and the same shall be paid by the employer and held as a set off for so much against the wages and said deserting employees. It was provided in some states, like South Carolina, that any white man, rather an officer or not, could arrest a black person, quote, upon view of a misdemeanor committed by a person of color. Any person present may arrest the offender and take him before the magistrate to be dealt with as the case may require. In case of a misdemeanor committed by a white person towards a person of color, any person may complain to the magistrate, who shall cause the offender to be arrested, and according to the nature of the case, to be brought before him, or be taken for trial in the district court, end quote. On the other hand, in Mississippi, it was dangerous for black people to try to bring a white person to court on any charge. In every case where any white person has been arrested and brought to trial by virtue of the provision of the 10th section of the above recited act, in any court of the state upon sufficient proof being made to the court or jury, upon the trial before said court, and any freeman, free black person, or biracial person has falsely and maliciously caused the arrest and trial of said white person, a person or persons, the court shall render up a judgment against said freeman, free black person, or biracial person for all cost of the case, and impose a fine not to exceed $50, and imprisonment in the county jail not to exceed 20 days. And for a failure of said freeman, free black person, or biracial person to pay or cause to be paid all cost, fines, and jail fees. And the sheriffs of the county is hereby authorized and required, after giving 10 days public notice, to proceed to hire out at public outcries at the courthouse of the country said freeman, no black person or biracial person, for the shortest time to raise the amount necessary to discharge said freeman, free black person, or biracial for all costs, fines, and jail fees aforesaid. And then we're going to go to Mississippi, everybody. Mississippi. Okay. Mississippi declared that any freeman, free black person, or biracial committing riots, routs, affrays, trespasses, malicious mischief, or cruel treatment to any animals, seditious speeches, insulting gestures, language of acts, or assaults on any person's disturbance of any of the peace, exercising the functions of a minister of the gospel without a license from such regularly organized church, vending spirituous or intoxicating liquor, or committing any other misdemeanors, the punishment of which is not specifically provided by law, shall, upon conviction, therefore, in the county court, be fined not less than $20 and not more than $100, and may be imprisoned at the discretion of the court, not exceeding 30 days. Kind of vague, I'd say. I feel like that's vague. I feel like it's really, really vague on that. Like anybody could judge and be like, you know what? That person I don't like, they're doing this. And it's mostly because, and who's going to listen to the black people and biracial people? Who's going to listen to them? They're not white, especially in these times. Great, they can take a white person to court. But again, like he said, how many were successful at that? As the other civil rights, the marriage of black peoples was for the first time recognized in the South states. Slave marriages legalized. South Carolina said in general, quote, that the statutes and regulations concerning slaves are not inapplicable, there we go, to persons of color. And although such persons are not entitled to social or political equality with white persons, they shall have the right to acquire, own, and dispose of property, to make contracts, to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to sue and be sued, and to receive protection under the law of their persons and property. Florida forbade, quote, people of color and white persons, respectively, not from intruding upon each other's public assemblies, religious or other, or public vehicle set apart for their exclusive use, under punishment of pillory or stripes, or both. Very generally, black people were prohibited or limited in their ownership of firearms. In Florida, for instance, it was, quote, unlawful for any black person, biracial person, or persons of color to own, use, or keep a possession or under control any Brownie knife, dirk, sword, firearms, or ammunition of any kind, unless by license of the county judge or of probate, under a penalty of forfeiting them to their informer, and of standing in the pillory 1 hour, or be wiped not exceedingly 39 stripes, or both, at the discretion of the jury. Alabama had a similar law, making it illegal to sell, give, or rent firearms or ammunition to any descriptions, quote, to any freeman, black person, biracial person. Mississippi refused arms to black people. No freemen, no black person. Now, freemen were, I think there are black people still. No freemen, free black person, or biracial, not in the military service of the United States government, and not licensed to do so by the board of police of his or her county, shall keep or carry firearms of any kind, or any ammunition, dirk, or bowie knife, and on conviction thereof in the county court, I did that opposite, shall be punished by fine, not exceeding $10, and pay the cost of such proceedings. And all such arms of ammunition shall be forfeited to the informer. Now, $10 is a lot of money in these days. So, in South Carolina, black person could only keep firearms on permission in writing from the district judge. Persons of color constitute no part of the militia of the state, and no one of them shall, without permission in writing from the district judge or magistrate, be allowed to keep a firearm, sword, or other military weapons, except that one of them, who is the owner of a firearm, may keep a shotgun, or rifle, such as is ordinarily used in hunting, but not a pistol, musket, or other firearms or weapons appropriated for purposes of war. And in cases of conviction, shall be punished by a fine equal to twice the value of the weapon, so unlawfully kept, and if that not be immediately paid, by corporal punishment. Jesus. The right to buying and selling property was usually granted, but sometimes limited, as to land. Mississippi declared, these fucking states are just shitty situations. Okay. Here we go, Mississippi. That all free men, black people, and biracial people may sue or be sued, and plead and to be impleaded in all the courts of law and equity of this state, and may acquire personal property and chooses in action by descent or purchase, and may dispose of the same in the same manner and to the same extent that white persons may, provided that the provision of this section shall not be so construed as to allow any freeman, black person, or biracial person to rent or lease any land or tenements, except in cooperated towns or cities, in which places the corporate authorities shall control the same. The most important and oppressive law were those with regard to vagrancies and apprenticeship. Sometimes they especially applied to black people. In other cases, they were drawn in general terms by evidently evidently designed to fit the black condition, to be forced, particularly with regards to black people. The Virginia Vagrant Law enacted that any justice of the peace upon the complaint of any one of certain officers therein named may issue his warrant for the apprehension of any person alleged to be a vagrant, and cause such persons to be apprehended and brought before him, and that if upon due examination said justice of the peace shall find that such persons is a vagrant within the definition of vagrancy contained in said statute, he shall issue his warrant directing such persons to be employed for a term not exceeding 3 months, and by any constable of the county therein the proceeding are had by hired out for the best wages which can be procured, his wages to be applied to the support of himself and his family. The said statute further provides that in case any vagrant who hired shall during his term of service run away from his employer without sufficient cause, he shall be apprehended on the warrant of a justice of the peace and return to the custody of his employer, who shall then have, free from any other hire, the services of such vagrant for 1 month in addition to the original terms of hiring, and that the employer shall then have power, if authorized by the justice of the peace, to work such vagrant with ball and chain. The said statute specified that persons who shall be considered vagrants and liable to penalties imposed by it, among those declared to be vagrants, are all persons who, not having the wherewith to support their family, live idly and without employment, and refuse to work for the usual and common wages given to other laborers in the like work in the place where they are. So they basically, goddamn. It's like, no, slavery's over with. No, it's not. Liars. Hey, Yusuf. In Florida, January 12th, 1866, it was provided that when a person of color shall enter into a contract as foresaid to service as a laborer for a year or any other specified term on any farm or plantation in this state, if he shall refuse to neglect to perform the stipulations of his contract by willfully disobedience of orders, wanton impudence, or disrespects to his employer, or his authorized agent's failure to refusal to perform the work assigned to him, idleness or abandonment of the premises, or the employment of the party with whom the contract was made, he or she shall be liable upon the complaint of his employer or his agent made under oath before any justice of the peace of the county, to be arrested and tried before the criminal court and the county, and upon conviction shall be subject to all the pains and penalties prescribed for the punishment of vagrancy. In Georgia, it was ruled that, I'm just reading a whole bunch of these vagrancy laws. That's all I'm doing. These black codes and everything. All persons wandering or strolling about in idleness, who are able to work and who have no property to support them, all persons leading an idle, immoral, and profligate life, who have no property to support them, and are able to work and do not work. All persons able to work, having no visible and known means of a fair, honest, and respectable livelihood. All persons having a fixed abode, who have no visible property to support them, and who live by stealing or by trading in, bartering for or buying stolen property. And all the professional gamblers living in idleness shall be deemed and considered vagrants. and shall be indicted as such, and it shall be lawful for any persons to arrest said vagrants and have them bound over for trial to the next term of the county court, and upon the conviction they shall be fined and imprisoned or sentenced to work on public works for not longer than a year, or shall in the discretion of the court be bound over for trial to the next term of county court, and upon conviction they shall be fined and imprisoned or sentences to work on public works for not longer than a year, or shall be discretion of the court by bond out to some person for a time no longer than a year, upon such variable consideration as the court may prescribe. This is wild, guy. This is wild, everybody. Mississippi. Here's Mississippi. Provided that all freemen, black people, and biracial people in this state over the age of 18 years, found on the second Monday in January 1866 or thereafter with no lawful employment or business, or found unlawfully assembling themselves together either in the day or nighttime, and all white persons who so assembling with free men, black people, or biracial people, or usually associating with free men, free black people, or biracial people in terms of equality, or living in adultery or fornication with a freed woman, free black person, or biracial person, shall be deemed vagrants, and no conviction, and on conviction thereof shall be fined in sum of not exceeding, in the case of free men, black people, biracial people, $50, and a white man, $200, and imprisoned at the discretion of the court, the free black person not exceeding 10 days, and the white man not exceeding 6 months. Interesting. Section 5 provides that all fines and forfeitures collected under the provision of this act shall be paid into the county treasury for general county purposes, and in case any freeman, black person, or biracial person shall fail for 5 days after the imposition of any fine or forfeiture upon him or her for violation of any of the provisions of this act, to be paid the same, that it shall be and is hereby made the duty of the sheriff of the proper county to hire out said freeman, black person, and biracial person to any person who will, for the shortest period of service, pay said fine or forfeiture, all costs, provided a preference shall be given to the employer if there be one, in which case the employer shall be entitled to deduct and retain the amount so paid from the wages of such freemen, free black people, or biracial people, then due or to become due. And in case such freeman, black person, and biracial person cannot be hired out, he or she may be dealt with as a pauper. South Carolina declared to be vagrants. South Carolina declared to be vagrants. All persons without fixed and known places of abode and lawful employment, all prostitutes, and all persons wandering from place to place and selling without a license, all gamblers, idle and disobedient persons without sufficient means of support, persons giving play or entertainments without license, fortune tellers, beggars, drunkards, and hunters. If a person of color is unable to earn his support, his near relatives must contribute. Paupers' funds were composed of fines paid by black people and taxes on black people. On the other hand, former slaves who were helpless and had been on plantations 6 months previous to November 10th, 1865, could not be evicted before January 1st, 1867. In Alabama, the former owner, quote unquote, was to have preference in the apprenticing of children, of a child. This was true in Kentucky and Mississippi. So this is bringing in a child. This is bad. This is not good. This is bad laws. Provided that it shall be the duty of all sheriffs, justice of the peace, and other civil officers of the several counties in this state to report to be probate courts and their respective counties semi-annually at the January and July terms of said court. All freemen, black people, and biracial people under the age of 18 within their respective counties, beats, and districts who are orphans or whose parents have not the means or who refuse to provide for to support said minors. And thereupon it shall be the duty of said probate court to order the clerk of said court to apprentice said minor to some competent and suitable person on such terms as the court may direct, having a particular care to the interests of said minor, provided that the former owner of said minor shall have the preference when, in the opinion of the court, he or she shall be a suitable person for their purpose. South Carolina established special courts for people of color to be created in each district to administer the law in respects of persons of color. The petite juries of these courts were consisted of only 6 men. The local magistrate shall be especially charged with the provision of persons of color in his neighborhood, their protection and the prevention of their misconduct. Public orders was to be secured by the organization of 45 or more militia regiments. Now this is an apartheid. They're doing different court. This is an apartheid. They just transfer this apartheid. Capital punishment. Oh, wait. Did I read that? Yeah. No. Let me read it again. No, I already read it. Capital punishment was provided for people of color guilty of willful homicide, assault upon a white woman, impersonating her husband for cardinal purposes, raising an insurrection, stealing a horse, a mule, or baled cotton, and housebreaking. For crimes not demanded death, black person might be confined to hard labor, whipped, or transported. Quote, but punishment more degrading than imprisonment shall not be imposed upon a white person for a crime not infamous. In most states, black people were allowed to testify in court, but the testimony was usually confined to case where people of color were involved. Although in some states, by consent of the parties, they could testify in cases where only white people were involved. In Alabama, all freemen, black people, and biracial people shall have the right to sue or be sued, plead or be impleaded in all the different and various courts of the state, to some extent that white persons now have by law, and any shall be competent to testify only in open court, and only in cases in which freemen, black people, and biracial people are parties, either plaintiff or defendant, and in any civil or criminal cases for injuries in the persons and property in freemen, black people, biracial people, and in all cases, civil or criminal, in which a freeman, black person, and biracial person is a witness against a white person, or a white person against a freeman, black person, or biracial person, the parties shall be competent witnesses. North Carolina, March 10th, 1866, quote, give them all the privileges of white persons before the court, in the mode of prosecuting, defending, continuing, removing, and transferring their suit at law of equity, and it makes them eligible as witnesses when not otherwise incompetent in, quote, all controversies at the law and in equity where the rights of a person or property of a person of color shall be put in issue and would be concluded by the judgment or decree of courts, and also in pleas of the state, where the violence, fraud, or injury alleged shall be charged to have been done by a person of color. In all other civil and criminal cases, such evidence shall be deemed inadmissible, unless by consent of the parties of record. Mississippi simply reenacted her slave code and made it operative so far as punishment was concerned. Quote, all the penal and criminal laws now in force in this state define offenses and prescribing the mode of punishment of crimes and misdemeanors committed by slaves, free black people, or biracial people by the same are hereby enacted and declared to be a full force and effect against freemen, black people, and biracial people, except so far as the mode of manner of trial and punishment have been changed to, or altered by law. North Carolina, on the other hand, abolished her slave code, making difference of punishment only in the case of black people convicted of rape. Georgia placed the fines and cost of a servant upon the master. Where such cases shall go against the servant, the judgment for cost upon written notice to the master shall operate as a garnishment against him, and he shall retain a sufficient amount for the payment thereof out of any wages due to said servant, or to become due during the period of service. It may be cited at any time by the collecting officer to make answers thereto. What do we got going on here?
Someone who assumed something, so I turned my camera on and showed them the book.
Oh, okay. What do they assume?
They assumed that we were just sitting here listening to you read because apparently commies don't ever read ourselves.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm a communist and I'm reading right now.
That's what I showed them. I was like, ha ha ha, you're wrong. Stop assuming things.
Maybe I'm reading so good that I sound like a recording. The celebrated ordinances of Okaloosa, Louisiana, shows the local ordinance and regulating black people. Let me finish the sentence. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm correcting you. The word is Okaloosa.
Thank you. I just wanted to finish the sentence. That's all.
Yeah, but I can't correct you after you're done.
Why? No black person or freeman shall be allowed to come within the limits of the town of
Okaloosa
without special permission from his employer, specifying the object of his visit and the time necessary for the accomplishment of the same. Every black person, freeman, who shall be found on the streets of
Okaloosa
after 10 o'clock at night within a written pass or permit from his employer shall be imprisoned and compelled to work 5 days on the public streets or pay a fine of $5. No black person or freeman shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within the limits of the town under any circumstances, and anyone thus offended shall be ejected and compelled to find an employer or leave the town within 24 hours. No black person or freeman shall reside within the limits of the town of Okaloosa, who is not in regular service of some white person or former owner, who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said freeman. No black person or freeman shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of people of color without a special permission from the mayor or president of the board of police, under the penalty of a fine of $10 or 20 days work on public streets. No freeman who is not in the military service shall be allowed to carry firearms or any kind of weapons within the limits of the town of Okaloosa. without a special permission of his employer, in writing and improved by the mayor of the president of the board. Any freeman not residing in Opelousas, who shall be found within its corporate limits after the hour of 3 o'clock on Sunday without a special permission from his employer or the mayor shall be arrested and imprisoned and made to work 2 days on the public streets or pay $2 in lieu of his said work. Louisiana, Thomas Conway testified February 22nd, 1886. Some of the leading officers of the state down there, men who do much to form and control the opinions of the masses, instead of doing as they promised and quietly submitting to the authority of the government, engaged in issuing slave codes and in prolongating them to their subordinates, ordering them to carry them out. In order to carry them out, into execution, and this is to acknowledge the state officials of a higher character, the governor and others, and the men who issued them were not punished except as the military authorities punished them. The governor inflicted no punishment on them while I was there, and I don't know that up to this day he has ever punished one of them. These codes were simply the old black codes of the state, with the word, quote, slave, impinged, and, quote, the N-word, meant for black, substituted. The most odious features of slavery were preserved in them. They were issued in 3 and 4 localities in the state, not 100 miles from New Orleans. Months after the surrender of the Confederate forces and years after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, I have had delegations to frequently come and see me. Delegations composed of men who, to my face, deny that the proclamation issued by President Lincoln was a valid instrument, declaring that the Supreme Court would pronounce it invalid. Consequently, they have claimed that their black people were slaves and would again be restored to them. In the cities of New Orleans last summer, under the orders of the acting mayor of the city, Hugh Kennedy, the police of that city conducted themselves towards the freemen in respect to violence and ill usage, in every way equal to the old days of slavery, arresting them on the streets as vagrants without any form of law whatever, and simply because they did not have in their pockets certificates of employment from their former owners or other white citizens. I have gone to the jails and released large numbers of them, men who were industrious and who had regular employment, yet because they had not the certificates of white men in their pocket, they were locked up in jail to be sent into the plantations, locked up to without any knowledge, and done speedily and secretly before I had information of it. Some members of the 74th United States Infantry of color, people of color in the infantry, a regiment which was mustered out, but one day were arrested, the next because they did not have their certificates of employment. This was done to these men after having served in the United States Army 3 years. They were arrested by the police under the order of the acting mayor, Mr. Hugh Kennedy. This is like papers, please. Papers, please. This is fucking fascist. This is fascism. The aim and object of these laws cannot be mistaken. Quote, in many cases, the restraints imposed went to the length of a veritable involuntary servitude. Professor Borges says, almost every act, word or gestures of black people not cognizant with good taste and good manners as well as good morals was made a crime or misdemeanor, for which he could first be fined by the magistrates and then co-signed to the conditions of almost slavery for the indefinite time if he could not pay the bill. Dunn admits that, quote, the legislation of the recognized governments under cover of police regulations and vagrancy laws had enacted severe discrimination against the freemen in all the common civil rights. A recent study says of South Carolina, here's a recent study, the interests of both races would have been better served had there never been a, quote, black code. This would be true even if there had been no northern settlements. Economically, the laws were impracticable since they tried people in a position of inferior to that which competition or his labor would have given him. But in this monotonous, yes, right, monotonous iteration to review the early legislation of the Reconstruction government established under the proclamation of the president. It must be the states. The laws establish a condition a little better than that of slavery. In one important respect, far worse. For in place of the property interest, which would induce the owner to preserve and care for his slave, there was substituted the guardianship and penal status, and the arrogant black man, innocent of any intentions of committing a wrong, could be banned about from one to another, who would have no other interest than to wring out of him, without regards to his ultimate conditions, all that was possible during the limited term of his thraldom. These slave laws have been defended in various ways. They were passed in the midst of bitterness and fear, and with great haste. They were worded somewhat like similar vagrancy laws in the North states. They would have been modified in time. They said more than they really meant. All of this may be partly true, but it remains perfectly evident that the black codes looked backward towards slavery. This legislation profoundly stirred in the North, not the North of industry and the new manufacturers, but the ordinary everyday people of the North, who, uplifted by the tremendous afflatus?
Afflatus?
I'll go look it up. Just real quick.
No problem.
Sudden intense creative impulse, afflatus of war, had seen the vision of something fine and just, and who, without any personal effect for the black person or real knowledge of him, nevertheless were convinced that black people were human, and that black slaves was wrong, and that whatever freedom might mean, it certainly did not mean re-enslavement under another name. Here then was the dominant thought of that South with which Reconstruction must deal, arising with aching heads and placid hands. It deliberately looked backward. There came to the presidential chair with vast power, a man who was Southern born. With him came inconceivable fears that the North proposed to make these black people really free, to give them a sufficient status, even for voting, to give them the right to hold office, that there was even a possibility that these slaves might outvote their former masters, that they might accumulate wealth and achieve education, and finally, they might be inspired to marry white women and mingle their blood with the blood of their masters. This was fantastic, not in a good way. It called for revolt. It called for extremity, for a renewal of war. The black person must be kept in his place by hunger, whipping, and murder. As W.P. Calhoun of Greenville, South Carolina said as late as 1901, quote, character, wealth, learning, good behavior, and all that makes up or constitutes good citizens in the black man is positively of no avail whatever. Merit cannot be in this case. Ew, that guy's a bleh. The cry of the bewildered freeman rose, but it was drowned by the rebel yell. I am a Southerner. I love the South. I dared for her. I fought from lookout to the sea, with her proud banner over me. But from my lips, Thanksgiving broke as God in battle thunder spoke, and the black idol, breeding drouth and dearth of human sympathy, throughout the sweet and sensuous South, was with its chains and human yoke blown hellward from the cannon's mouth, while freemen cheer behind the smoke. Maurice Thompson. And that's the end of that chapter. Interesting. We're on chapter 7. Looking forward. Any questions besides them bringing on slavery still and continuing it and just transforming it into a different type of form?
I don't have any questions. I wanted to say you're doing a particularly great job reading today. And I was worried, and hi Dutch. I was worried about that poem for a second because it was the rebel yell for the South, and I was worried about how bad it was going to be. But yeah, they just took slave codes and wrote black codes.
Looking forward. How two theories of the future of America clashed and blended just after the Civil War. The one was abolition democracy based on freedom, intelligence, and power for all men. The other was industry or private profit, directed by the autocracy. Got it. Autocracy, determined at any price to amass wealth and power. The incomprehending resistance of the South and the pressure of black folk made these two thoughts uneasy and temporary allies. A printer and a carpenter, a rail splitter and a tailor, Garrison Christ, Lincoln, and Johnson were the tools of the greatest moral awakening America ever knew, chosen to challenge capital invested in the bodies of men and annual and private profit of slavery. This done to quite distinct, but persistently indifferentiated visions of the future dominated and the triumphant North after the war. One was the prolongation of Puritan idealism, transformed by the frontier into a theory of universal democracy, and now expressed by the abolitionists like Wendell Phillips, students of civilization like Charles Sumner, the leaders of the common people like Thaddeus Stevens, together with some of the leaders of the new labor movement. And other trend was entirely different and is confused with the democratic ideal because the two ideals lay confused in so many individuals' minds. This was the development of industry and America and of the new industrial philosophy. A new industry was a vision not of work but of wealth, not of planning accomplishment but of power, to become the most conscienceless unmoral system of industry which the world has experienced. It went with ruthless indifference towards waste, death, ugliness, and disaster, and yet reared the most stupendous machine for the efficient organization of work which the world has ever seen. Thus, the end of the Civil War was the beginning of a vast economic development and an industrial expansion to the east, and the agricultural growth of the Middle West, in the new cattle industry of the plains, in the mining enterprises of the Rockies, in the development of the Pacific coast, and in the reconstruction of the southern market. Behind this extraordinary industrial development, as justification in the minds of men, lay what they may call the great American assumption, which up to the time of the Civil War was held more or less explicitly by practically all Americans. Practically all Americans. Hey, another visual thing. The American assumption was that wealth is mainly the result of its owner's effort, and that any average worker can only become a capitalist. The curious thing about this assumption was that while it was not true, it was undoubtedly more nearly true in America from 1820 to 1860 than in any other contemporary land. It was not true and not recognized as true during colonial times, but with the opening of the West and the expanding industries of the 20s and the coincident with the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, it was a fact that often a poor white man in America, by thrift and saving, could obtain land and capital, and by intelligence and good luck, he could become a small capitalist and even a rich man. And conversely, a careless spendthrift, though rich, might become a pauper, since hereditary safeguards for property had little legal sanction. Thus arose the philosophy of, quote, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, on which the American theory of compensated democracy was built. It asked simply in 18th century accents, freedom from government's interference with individual ventures, and the voice of the selection of government officials, and the continued freedom of economic opportunity, and every possible increase of industrial income. It took it for granted. This attitude was back of the adoption of universal suffrage, the disappearance of compulsory military service and imprisonment for debt, which characterizes Jacksonian's democracy. The American assumption was contemporary with the Cotton Kingdom, which was its most sinister contradiction. The new captains of industry in the North were largely arisen from the laboring class, and thus living proof of the ease of capitalist accumulation. The validity of the American assumption ceased with the Civil War, but its traditions lasted down to the day of the Great Depression, when it died with the great wail of despair. Not so much from bread lines and soup kitchens, as from poor and thrifty bank depositors and small investors. The American labor movement, founded in the spirit that regarded America as a refuge from oppression and free for individual development, according to this conscious and ability, grew and expanded in America, basing itself frankly upon the American assumption. Its object was rule by the people and wide education of people so that they could rule intelligently, and economic opportunity of wealth free from thrift. It found itself hindering by slavery in the South directly because of the growing belief of the influential planter class and oligarchy, and the degradation of labor, and directly by the competition of slave labor and the spread of the slave psychology. It became, therefore, at first more and more opposed to slavery as ethically wrong, politically dangerous, and economically unprofitable. Capital, on the other hand, accepted widespread suffrage as a fact forced on the world by revolution and the growing intelligence of the working class. But since the new industry called for intelligence in its workers, capitalists not only accepted universal suffrage, but early discovered that high wages in America made even higher profits possible, and that this high standard of living was itself a protection for capital, in that it made the more intelligent and best paid of workers allies of capital, and left its ultimate dictatorship undisturbed. Nevertheless, industry took pains to protect itself wherever possible. It excluded illiterate foreign voters from the ballot and advocated to reservoir of non-voting common labor. And it stood ready at any time by direct bribery to the use of its power to hire and discharge labor to manipulate the labor vote. So they did it back then, they're doing it now, yeah. The true significance of slavery in the United States to the whole social development of America laid in the ultimate relations of slaves to democracy. There were to be the limits of democratic control in the United States. If all labor, black as well as white, became free, were given schools and the right to vote, what controls should be set to the power and action of these laborers? Was the rule of the mass of the Americans to be unlimited, and the right to rule extended to all men, regardless of race and color? Or if not, what power of dictatorship would rule? And how would property and privilege be protected? This was the great and primary questions which was in the minds of the men who wrote the Constitution of the United States, and continued in their minds of the thinkers down through the slavery controversy. It still remains with the world as a problem of democracy expands the touches of all races and nations. The abolition, thank you for approving. The abolition democracy was a liberal movement among both laborers and small capitalists, who united in the American assumption, but saw the danger of slavery to both capital and labor. It began its moral fight against slavery in its 30s and 40s, and gradually transformed by economic elements, including it during the war. The only real object of the Civil War in its eyes was the abolition of slavery, and it was convinced that this could not thoroughly accomplish only if the emancipated black person became free citizens and voters. The abolition of democracy saw clearly the difficulties of this step due to the arrogance and poverty of a free man. For the first time in the classic democracy of the United States, it was made aware that the American assumption was not and could not be universally true. Some of the leaders of the labor movement came to see that it was not true in the case of the mass of white labor. But that thought came to the abolitionists afterwards in the minds of only a few clear-sighted men, like Wendell Phillips. At the time of the Civil War, it was, however, perfectly clear to Sumner and Stevens that freedom, in order to be free, required a minimum of capital in addition to political rights, and that this could be ensured against the natural resentment of the planters only by some sort of dictatorship. Thus, the abolition democracy was pushed towards the conception of a dictatorship of labor. Although few of its advocates wholly grasped the fact that this necessarily involved dictatorship by labor over capital and industry. On the other hand, industrialists after the war expected the South to seize upon the opportunity to make increased profits by the more intelligent exploitation of labor than was possible under the slave system. They looked upon free black labor as a source of profit and considered freedom, that is, a legal doing away of individual physical control, all that black people or their friends could ask. They did not want black labor any special protection or political power or capital, and any more than they wanted this for Irish, German, and Scandinavian labor in the North. They expected some popular education and gradual granting of the right to vote, which would be straightly curtailed in its power of mischief by the far larger power of capital. The South, however, persisted in its pre-war conception of these two tendencies in the North. It sought to reestablish slavery by force because it had no comprehension of the means by which modern industry could secure the advantage of slave labor without its responsibilities. The South, therefore, opposed black education, opposed land and capital for black people, and violently and bitterly opposed any political power. It fought every conception inch by inch. No real emancipation, limited civil rights, no black schools, no votes for black people. In the face of such intransigence, Northern industry was, on the whole, willing to yield, since none of these concessions really obstructed the expansion of industry and capital in the nation. When we, however, the South, went beyond reason, the truculently demanded not supply its old political power, but increased political power based on disenfranchised black people, which is openly threatened to use it for the revision of the tariff, for the repudiation of the national debts, and the disestablishing of national banks, and for putting the new corporate form of industry under strict state regulations and rule. Northern industries were frightened and began to move towards the stand which abolition democracy had already taken, namely temporary dictatorship, endowed black education, legal civil rights, and eventually even votes for black people to offset the Southern threats of economic attack. The abolition democracy was not deceived. It at once feared and dared. It wanted no revenge on the South and held no hatred. It did not want to train black people in intelligence, experience, and labor, the ownership of land and capital, and exercise the civil rights, and the use of political power. In the advocacy of these things, it reached the highest level of self-sacrificing statesmanship ever attained in America. The two of the greatest leaders of the ideal, Stevens and Sumner, voluntarily laid down their lives on the altar of democracy and were eventually paid as they must have anticipated. They would be paid by the widespread contempt of America. Even to this day, the grandsons of the abolitionists, ashamed of their fathers' faith in black men, were salving their confidence with their theory that the democratic governments by intelligent men of character is impossible when, in fact, nothing else is possible. And the grandsons of the planters of the poor whites were displaced. Who displaced them were excusing their apostasy to civilization by charging the black person with all the evil causes of war, destruction, and greed, and by the deeds of white men, Northern and Southern. The abolition democracy advocated federal control to guide and direct the rise of black people. But they desired this control to be civil rather than military, like the strict government of territories until new states should be developed. They had to help them in the furtherance of this plan and a degree of enthusiasm, humility, and hard work on the part of the depressed black person, which is not paralleled in modern history. When now they were offered alliance with Northern industry, temporary military control instead of civil government, and then immediate citizenship and the right to vote for black people instead of the period of guardianship. They accepted because they could not refuse, because they knew that this was their only way, only chance, and that nothing else would be offered. Their theory of democracy led them to risk all, even in the absence of that economic and educational minimum, which they knew was next to indispensable. When Sumner saw his failure here, he went home and wept. But the belief in this self-resurrection of democracy was strong in these men and lent unconscious power to the American assumption. They expected that both Northern industries and the South, in their sheer self-defense, would have an educated black person, intelligence, and depend on black political power. The South was too astonished for belief. When I saw industry and democracy in the North united for the policy of coercion, in the past the South had always been able to mere gestures of concession to bring Northern industry to its knees, begging. It did not realize how strong industry had grown and how conscious its power and how boundless its plans. It did not realize that the basis of the South, the bias of the South owned power.
You're right.
Literally been swept away. Even the West, on which the South had long counted, in theory, along sympathy, had seldom led to effect action, while it fought industrial monopoly and national debt, and the money power. Yet, when it had to choose between the continuation of Southern oligarchy and the great domestic movement, swung inevitably towards democracy. Northern capital went south, invade with the planters for the direction of the black vote. Poor whites secured to cover. Now here,
Poor whites scurried to cover.
Yeah, you can just yeah. The name. Yeah. I'm sorry. Scurry to cover. Now here, now there, and a dictatorship of labor ensued, with a new democratic constitution, new social legislations, public schools, and public improvements. But of that we shall speak more in detail in later chapters. On the other hand, Northern industry seemed at least free and untrammeled. It began in 1876, an exploitation which was built on much the same sort of slavery which it helped to overthrow in 1963. It murdered democracy in the United States so completely that the world does not recognize its corpse. It established as dominant in industry and monarchical system monarchy system, which killed the ideal of democracy. The basis of this argument for black suffrage has usually been interrupted as a gesture of vengeance, but it was much deeper than this. It was phrased first by Abraham Lincoln himself as a method of retaining, quote, the jewel of liberty in the family of freedom. This was echoed, however, unwillingly by Andrew Johnson as a sop to the radicals, but it gradually came in the thought of the nation to be an inescapable thing. Votes for black people were in truth a final compromise between businesses and abolition, and were forced on abolition by businesses as the only method of realizing the basic principles of abolition democracy. All of the selfishness, cunning, and power that were back of the new industry of the North have been looked upon as simply the other side of abolition democracy. And the reason for this was that in several cases, the two ideas were mingled in individuals' minds. One can see that in the sermon of Henry Ward Beecher, who was a great advocate of votes for black people, but nevertheless instinctively capitalistic, standing on the side of exploiters. He had scant sympathy for the exploited. There was something of this, although not nearly as much in the case of Thaddeus Stevens, who was at the heart of the greatest and most uncompromising of abolitionist Democrats, but who advocated not only universal suffrage and free schools, but protections for Pennsylvania iron. Yet, in the protection, he had just as distinctly in mind the welfare of the laborers as a profit of the employers. What then was the strength of the democratic movement which succeeded the war? In many respects, it was emotional. It swept the land with its music of poetry, a war which to the intense dissatisfaction of the abolitionists had begun with the district object, even on the part of the greater emancipator, to save and protect slavery, and in no way to disrupt it, except to keep it out of competition with free peasants in the West, had resulted in emancipation. Men like William Lloyd Garrison, who had no sympathy with the platform of the Republicans in 1860, became suddenly a center of the stage of a new dispensation. Thus, a legal metaphysical dispute involving the rights of slave states to expand into the territories was rapidly changed, first to the question of freedom for slaves, and then to the struggle of inaugurating a new form of national government in the United States. When the physical war ended, then the real practical problems presented themselves. How was slavery to be effectively abolished? And what was the status of black people? What was the condition and power of the states which had rebelled? The legal solution of these questions was easy. The states that had attempted to rebel had failed. They must now resume their relations to the government. Slavery had been abolished as a war measure. This should be confirmed and extended by the constitutional amendment. Some control of black population must be devised in the place of slavery, so as to introduce black people into a new freedom. The power of the national government had been greatly expanded by war. This expansion must be consolidated so that the future successions would be impossible and slavery never reestablished. The difficulty with this legalistic formula was that it did not cling to facts. Slavery was not abolished. Even after the 13th Amendment, there were 4 million free men, and most of them on the same plantations, doing the same work that they did before emancipation, except as their work had been interrupted and changed by the upheaval of war. Moreover, they were getting about the same wages, and apparently were going to be subjects of slave codes modified only in name. There were among them thousands of fugitives in the camps of the soldiers or on the streets of the cities, homeless, sick, and impoverished. They had been freed practically with no land, no money, and, save in exceptional case, without legal status and without protection. Black people deserve not only the pity of the world, but the gratitude of both South and North. Under extraordinary provocations, they had acted like decent human beings. They had protected their master's family when their master were away fighting for black slavery. They did this naturally, because they were not sure that the North was fighting for freedom, and because they did not know which side would win. Real quick, I'm gonna look ahead. 2:30. Remember 2:30. Probably not ahead. 2:30. Oh my gosh. Looks like there's a lot before 2:30. Yep. All right. I think that might be 2:30. Sounds like he's doing a brief summary too right now of like all these things and how these things didn't transfer and they didn't really do anything for black people. They just, yeah, sure, and like they gave them wages, but they still were utilizing like enslavement behavior towards them and stuff. So we'll stop right here. But at any rate, I don't know. Hold on, let me read this paragraph. But at any rate, they did not. What?
I said, yeah.
Yeah. But at any rate, they did it. And even when they understood that the North, willingly or unwilling, was bound towards freedom, and that they could fight for their own freedom, they were neither vindictive nor cruel towards their former masters, although they were quite naturally widely accused of quote-unquote laziness and prudence, quote-unquote, which are the only weapons of offense, which a rising social class can easily use. We'll stop there. Might not be a good stopping point, but it's not another thing for a long time.
Well,
Black codes. 2:30.
Yep, 2:30. It was a good read. I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to tell you that, like, you said everything I wanted to say basically as you were reading. So, like, I don't really have much to add.
Yeah, and they're just like redefining slavery and redefining ways to get black people into slavery by not giving them the property, the things, and having them have to the papers thing. It's just like Nazi Germany. Like are you a Jewish person? Like, it's just like that. It's absolutely like that. And like, I don't know. They didn't care. They just wanted they wanted the profits and they wanted the resources because, like, again, they resulted into not wanting to do anything to the slaves, not wanting the plantations to be disrupted or anything. They just wanted their resources and their their profits and their economies. Both of them. They're both just racist pieces of shit. Like, you know how people talk about, well, the Democrats are the ones that brought into that developed the KKK. Well, sure, that's the Confederacy, but let's look at the North too. They're just as bad too. Like, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? You know, their racism was in different forms, per se. You know what I mean? So it was no difference. It was just white people wanting to fight over economic wealth. You know what I mean? That's what it was.
Yep.
Black people freed themselves, plain and simple. End of story. So, anything else?
Nope.
All right. Anybody want to come up and say anything? Give it a second. Nope, not many people here anyways. Just us. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.